The geometry of the mirror dimension did not shatter like glass, but rotted like gangrenous flesh, turning the kaleidoscopic fractals of New York City into a weeping saw of biological impossibility. Stephen Strange had stood against the dread Dormammu and bargained for the fate of realities. Yet he had never felt a sensation of violation quite like this, because it was not an invasion of force, but of hunger that bypassed the metaphysical immunities of the Sorcerer Supreme. The protective seals of the Sanctum Sanctorum usually burned with the golden light of the Vishanti, safeguarding the intersection of ley lines from extra-dimensional threats. But now they turned a sickly crimson before dissolving into ash that smelled of dried blood and ancient stagnation. Strange suspended himself in the center of the rotunda, his scarred hands weaving the crimson bands of Sitarak to hold the structural reality together. But the bands went slack, as if the very concept of binding magic had been murdered by a higher predator. A tear in the fabric of space-time opened above the grand staircase, not a portal of swirling sparks or cosmic energy, but a sliding door of paper and wood that should not exist in this dimension, or any dimension mapped by Kamartaj. The door slid open with a sound that echoed like a breaking spine, and from the darkness beyond came a gravity that ignored the laws of physics, pulling not at Strange's physical form, but at the astral tether of his soul, dragging him toward a void that felt undeniably alive. Wong was shouting something about the wand of Watum, but his voice sounded miles away, submerged in deep water, distorted by the sheer density of the invading pressure. Strange realized too late that this was not an attack by a rival sorcerer or a cosmic entity seeking dominion, but a predation event where the universe on the other side of that sliding door was starving and had found a way to feed on the concentrated magical density of 177A Bleecker Street. Strange thrust his hands forward, collapsing the localized time fill around the breach in a desperate attempt to freeze the intrusion in a loop of eternal stillness. And the eye of Agamotto opened, revealing the green brilliance of the time stone. Yet the light flickered and dimmed, as if suffocated by a smoke that swallowed light itself. The invading reality did not operate on linear time, nor did it respect the sovereignty of the Infinity Stones, because it operated on biological cycles of consumption and regeneration that defied the mystic arts. The wooden door frame expanded, shooting out roots of tatami and cypress that pierced the sanctum's floor, and Strange felt a cold, damp hand close around his ankle, which was invisible yet heavier than a collapsed star. The cloak of levitation strained against the pull, snapping its collar in a panic that Strange shared but could not voice, because he knew that if the sanctum fell, New York would become a feeding trough for whatever lurked in that endless labyrinth of wood and shadow. He made the only tactical choice left to a Sorcerer Supreme, facing a total containment breach, which was to enter the wound to cauterize it from the inside, rather than letting the infection spread to the Earth 616 dimension. Strange released the bands of Sitarak and channeled every ounce of ambient mana into a shield of the seraphim, wrapping it tight around his skin like a second dermis before he let the gravity take him. The transition was not instantaneous like a portal step, but a violent dragging sensation through layers of cold, suffocating darkness that smelled of wisteria and iron, where he felt his connection to the Vishanti sever, not with a snap, but with a fading whimper. The silence of the void was replaced by the deafening sound of a biwa lute being struck, once a sharp percussive note that vibrated through his bones and shattered his shields. Stephen Strange hit the ground hard, and it was not the floor of a mystical dimension, but dirt-cold, hard-packed earth. The air was thin and lacked the vibrant hum of modern electricity or the dense ley lines of New York, leaving him gasping, as if he had surfaced on a mountain peak. He pushed himself up, coughing, as the dust settled, and saw he was in a forest of bamboo, the stalks stretching up toward a moon that looked too large and too pale, while the stars formed constellations that were centuries out of alignment. His hands shook and the magic in his veins felt sluggish, as if the atmosphere itself was rejecting his presence, or perhaps hoarding its energy for something else. He looked at the Eye of Agamotto and saw the lid was closed tight, refusing to open. He was blind to the future. From the shadows of the bamboo grove came a sound that froze the blood in his veins, a wet, clicking sound, followed by a voice that spoke Japanese with an archaic, hungry cadence, asking him why his blood smelled so remarkably rare. The creature that emerged from the bamboo shadows was a grotesque tapestry of human misery and predatory evolution, its body elongated and pale with extra joints that cracked audibly as it moved on all fours, like a spider made of porcelain and wet muscle. Stephen Strange did not flinch, because he had stared into the eyes of Shumagorath and negotiated with cosmic abstract entities. But this creature possessed a pathetic intimacy that those eldritch horrors lacked. It wore the tattered remains of a kimono stained with dried fluids, and its eyes were wide, manic, and engraved with a singular starving madness that bypassed reason. Strange raised his hands in the Tau mandalas, waiting for the familiar surge of dimensional energy to crystallize into hard light shields. But the response was delayed a fraction of a second, a terrifying latency caused by the thinning of the magical atmosphere in this universe. The shields flickered into existence, sputtering like the dying candle before solidifying into a translucent orange geometry just as the creature lunged. The impact was kinetic and massive, hitting with the force of a hydraulic press rather than a magical concussion, cracking the earth beneath Strange's boots and forcing him to slide backward through the dirt. This was not a magical construct or a summoned spirit. It was a biological organism with density and muscle mass that defied its spindly frame. Strange analyzed the attack vector, instantly calculating that the creature moved faster than the human eye could track, but slower than the mind could process. He rotated his wrists, transitioning from defense to offense, and cast the bolts of Balthak, expecting the lightning-like discharge to incinerate the entity. The energy lashed out, striking the creature's shoulder and searing the flesh. But instead of turning to ash, the wound began to bubble and knit together in real time, the cells multiplying with a violent hissing sound that smelled of sulfur and burning hair. Strange narrowed his eyes, realizing that standard evocation spells were insufficient against a biology that rejected entropy so aggressively. The creature shrieked a sound of pure gluttony and lunged again, its fingers extending into bone whips that lashed against Strange's levitation cloak, which acted on its own volition to wrap around Strange's left arm, turning into a hardened gauntlet to deflect the blow. Strange needed distance to reassess the local physics, so he invoked the winds of a tomb, but the spell felt heavy, as if the air in this world was too dense to manipulate easily. A gust of cyclonic force blasted the creature back, smashing it through 3 thick bamboo stalks, but it recovered mid-air, twisting its spine like a cat and landing on a tree trunk, gripping the bark with unnatural friction. Strange realized he was fighting a localized apex predator in an environment where his own fuel source was scarce. He needed to end this quickly before he exhausted his internal reserves. He reached into the metaphysical pocket of his tunic, seeking the wand of Watum, but his fingers brushed against empty fabric, reminding him that his artifacts had not transitioned with him or were scattered across the entry vector. He was limited to his own soul and the crippled eye of Agamotto hanging dead against his chest. The creature leaped from the tree, diving with claws extended, and Strange decided to stop playing by the rules of magical duel. He conjured a portal not to transport the beast, but to bisect it, a tactical decapitation, using the spatial edge of a gateway opening and closing in a microsecond. The spark gaped open a ring of fiery sparks slicing through the creature's neck. The head tumbled to the ground with a wet thud, and the body collapsed, twitching violently. Strange exhaled, smoothing his tunic and stepping back, expecting the carcass to dissolve or remain inert. But the head on the ground blinked. The eyes swiveled toward him, and the mouth curved into a rictus grin of mockery. The severed body pushed itself up blindly, groping for its missing piece. Strange watched in horrified fascination as the flesh tendrils erupted from the neck stump seeking connection. This was not just regeneration. This was immortality anchored to a specific biological law he had not yet identified. He prepared a spell of total molecular disintegration, a heavy cost maneuver that would leave him drained, but he stopped when a blur of motion cut through the grove. It was not magic. It was a person. A figure clad in a mismatched hari of maroon and geometric patterns moved with a fluidity that rivaled the creature slicing through the air, with a blade that hummed with a specific resonance. The swordsman did not attack the body, but targeted the severed head, kicking it into the air and delivering a vertical slash that carried the visual weight of a tidal wave. Water actually manifested, trailing the blade in the impossible hydrokinetic phenomenon that washed over the demon's head, disintegrating it into ash rather than just cutting it. Strange sensed no spell casting, no incantation, and no mana manipulation. This was sheer willpower imposed upon reality through a physical medium. The swordsman landed softly, the water vanishing as quickly as it had appeared, and sheathed the blade with a sharp click that signaled the finality of the engagement. The demon's body crumbled into dust, leaving only the empty clothes behind. Strange lowered his hands, dissipating the mandalas, but kept his guard raised, knowing that in a world of monsters, the hunters were often just as dangerous. The swordsman turned, revealing a stoic face with deep blue eyes that seemed devoid of ripples like a stagnant ocean. Kiyu Tomioka looked at Stephen Strange, not with awe or confusion, but with the cold calculation of an exterminator finding a new species of pest. Strange spoke first, utilizing a translation spell that vibrated in his throat to match the archaic dialect of the era. He identified himself as Dr. Stephen Strange, Sorcerer Supreme of the Earth Dimension, and requested immediate intelligence on the nature of the hostile entity. Kiyu stared at him for a long moment, his hand resting on the tilt of his katana. He did not ask about the sparks or the floating cloak. He asked simply if Strange was a man or a demon who had forgotten how to hide his aura. Strange frowned, offended by the classification. He explained that he was a master of the mystic arts, a protector of reality. Kiyu's expression did not change. He stated that there were no mystic arts, only the breath and the blade, and the demons who ate men in the dark. He accused Strange of smelling like ozone and old blood, a scent that confused the senses. Strange realized that to this warrior, his magical signature read as a disturbance indistinguishable from the monsters he hunted. This was the first major divergence of the timeline. In the Marvel Universe, magic was a known, if misunderstood, science. Here, it was an aberration. Strange stepped forward, intent on diplomacy, but the cloak of levitation sensed the hostility and flared up, rising behind Strange like a red cobra. Kiyu drew his blade, instantly moving faster than before, closing the gap. with a thrust aimed at Strange's throat. It was not a killing blow, but a testing one designed to see if the target would bleed or regenerate. Strange did not dodge. He transmuted the air in front of him into a solid plane of glass. The katana struck the barrier and shattered it, but the impact force transferred through, pushing Strange back. He was impressed. This human possessed physical attributes that bordered on the superhuman achieved without mutation or magic, but through rigorous conditioning. Strange countered with the crimson bands of Sitarak, unleashing the red ribbons of energy to restrain the swordsman. The bands wrapped around Gyu's limbs, lifting him into the air, but Gyu twisted his body, breathing in a specific rhythm that Strange could hear. A sharp intake of oxygen that hyper-oxygenated his blood and flooded his muscles with adrenaline. Gyu shouted a technique name, water-breathing second form water wheel, and spun his body with enough torque to physically shatter the magical construct of Sitarak. Strange recoiled. The bands were unbreakable by physical means, yet this man had broken them by vibrating his body at a frequency that disrupted the spell's matrix. This was the revelation. The breathing styles were not just sword techniques. They were a form of somatic magic that utilized the user's own life force and the atmosphere to override the laws of physics. Strange realized he could not fight this man with standard containment spells, because the man was a living tuning fork capable of shattering resonance. Strange shifted tactics, levitating upward out of sword range. He declared that he was not an enemy, but the swordsman remained unconvinced, staring up with the patience of a stone. The standoff was broken not by words, but by the arrival of a third party. A crow descended from the canopy, cawing loudly in the same archaic Japanese, its voice raspy and intelligent. It landed on Gyu's shoulder and screeched a message about a disturbance in the mountain, a star that fell and broke the sky. Strange realized the crow was talking about him, the arrival event. The crow looked at Strange with bead-black eyes and squawked that the master demanded the presence of the foreigner at the Ubuyashiki estate immediately. Gyu sheathed his sword instantly, the hostility evaporating into professional obedience. He gestured for Strange to follow. Strange considered refusing, considered opening a portal to anywhere else, but his curiosity was piqued. He needed to understand the hierarchy of power in this world if he was to find a way home, and this master seemed to be the apex of the local authority. He descended, touching the ground, and smoothed his tunic. He nodded to Gyu. They walked in silence through the bamboo forest, leaving the pile of demon ash behind. As they walked, Strange observed the world around him with the eyes of a neurosurgeon and a sorcerer. The spiritual pressure of this dimension was immense. The trees, the soil, the air itself felt saturated with a heavy, sorrowful energy. It was a world where the veil between the living and the dead was incredibly thin, yet heavily patrolled. He sensed ghosts everywhere, not the noisy poltergeists of New York, but silent watchers lingering in the shadows of the trees. He realized that in this universe, death was not a departure, but an accumulation. They traveled for hours, moving at a pace that would have exhausted a normal man. But Strange used minor levitation charms to glide centimeters above the ground, matching the swordsman's sprint. They passed a village destroyed by some calamity, the houses smashed into kindling. Strange stopped seeing the bodies laid out in rows. He knelt by a child examining the wounds. They were not just bite marks, they were excisions, chunks of flesh removed with surgical precision. He felt a flare of anger, the same cold fury that had driven him to use the time stone against Dormammu. This was not predation, it was cruelty. Gyu stopped and watched him. He told Strange to leave the dead alone. Strange ignored him, placing a hand on the child's forehead, muttering a benediction of the Vishanti. to guide the soul to whatever afterlife existed here. A small golden light drifted from the body and vanished upwards. Giyu's eyes widened slightly. He had never seen a soul release so visibly. He asked what Strange had done. Strange replied that he had merely opened the door. They continued moving, but the dynamic had shifted. Giyu no longer looked at him as a monster, but as an anomaly that required solving. They arrived at the base of a mountain covered in wisteria flowers. The scent hit Strange like a physical wall. To him, it smelled of antiseptic and holy water, a cleansing barrier that repelled necrotic energy. He analyzed the pollen as they passed, realizing it contained a trace element that disrupted the cellular regeneration he had seen in the demon. It was a natural poison to the unnatural. They ascended the mountain, passing young warriors in uniform who stared at Strange's bizarre attire, the blue tunic, the high collar, the billowing red cloak. They whispered about the foreigner who floated. Strange ignored them, focusing on the mansion at the summit. It was a sprawling estate of traditional architecture, unassuming yet radiating a psychic presence that Strange found overwhelming. It was not the presence of a god or a demon, but of a human soul, so expansive and empathetic that it felt like a gravity well. They entered the courtyard, where 9 figures stood in a semicircle. Strange recognized the stance of elite warriors. Each one radiated a different frequency of energy. One burned like a furnace. Another felt like solid rock. Another buzzed with the chaotic static of a thunderstorm. The Hashira, they turned as one to face Strange. The tension was immediate and absolute. A man with scars covering his face and body stepped forward, his eyes wild and violent. Sanemi Shinazugawa. He demanded to know why Giyu had brought a circus performer to the master's garden. Strange bristled at the insult, his ego flaring. He introduced himself again, adding his full title and academic credentials. Sanemi laughed a harsh barking sound and drew his blade, moving with the speed of the wind itself. He aimed to intimidate, to graze Strange's cheek to test the foreigner's mettle. But Strange was done with tests. He did not move his body. He moved time. He rotated his fingers in a counterclockwise circle, manipulating the local temporal field around his own body. Sanemi's blade slowed to a crawl, the wind pressure dropping to a gentle breeze. Strange stepped sideways, casually watching the blade inch past his ear, then release the time loop. The sudden return of linear time caused a sonic boom as the displaced air rushed back in. Sanemi stumbled forward, his equilibrium shattered by the temporal lag. The other Hashira drew their weapons instantly, sensing a threat level that defied their understanding. Strange raised his hands, the shield of the seraphim expanding to cover the entire courtyard, a dome of intricate golden geometry that hummed with power. He told them to cease their aggression, or he would dismantle their weapons at a molecular level. The statement was not a bluff. The Hashira hesitated, confused by the light and the geometry. Then a voice cut through the tension. It was soft, barely a whisper, yet it carried across the courtyard with perfect clarity. Kagaya Ubuyashiki emerged from the inner sliding doors, assisted by his daughters. The curse that ravaged his face was visible, a purple web of decay that Strange recognized immediately. It was not a disease. It was a karmic backlash, a generational curse tied to a bloodline origin. Strange lowered the shield, instantly recognizing the aura of the man. It was the same aura he had felt earlier, the gravity well of empathy. Kagaya smiled blindly at the direction of Strange's energy. He welcomed the Sorcerer Supreme and apologized for the rudeness of his children. He invited Strange to sit. Strange did so, folding his legs in the lotus position, hovering a foot off the tatami mats. The Hashira were stunned into silence. Kagaya spoke of a vision he had seen a star falling from another world, bringing with it a change in the wind. He asked Strange why he had come. Strange explained the breach, the hunger he had felt, the accident that brought him here. He spoke of the multiverse of threats that dwarfed this planet. He spoke of Thanos, of Dormammu, of the fragile nature of reality. The Hashira listened skeptically, but Kagaya listened with belief. When Strange finished, Kagaya asked a single question. He asked if Strange's magic could kill Muzan Kibutsuji. Strange admitted he did not know the name. Kagaya explained the origin of the demons, the progenitor, the first monster. He explained the 1,000-year war, the stalemate, the endless accumulation of dead children. Strange listened, and his surgeon's mind began to assemble the puzzle. A singular biological source, a hive mind, a weakness to sunlight. It was a viral infestation on a metaphysical scale. Strange looked at the curse on Kagaya's face. He asked if he could examine it. Kagaya nodded. Strange floated forward, ignoring the growls of Sanemi and the serpent Hashira Obanai. He placed his hand over Kagaya's face, the eye of Agamotto shuddering against his chest. He cast a diagnostic spell, the flames of the Faltine illuminating the curse's structure. What he saw terrified him. The curse was not just biological. It was a tether, a direct line connecting Kagaya to Muzan across space. And through that tether, Strange felt something looking back. A consciousness cold, ancient, and paralyzingly narcissistic. Muzan Kibutsuji sensed the intrusion. He sensed the alien energy of the Sorcerer Supreme. And across the miles in the Infinity Fortress, the Demon King opened his eyes. Back in the courtyard, Strange pulled his hand back, gasping as psychic frost burned his fingertips. He told Kagaya that his enemy knew he was here now. The element of surprise was gone. The breach in the sky above the estate cracked open further, the clouds turning a bruised purple. Strange looked up, realizing the physics of this universe were reacting to his presence by accelerating the conflict. He had not just entered the game. He had broken the board. He looked at the Hashira, who were now looking at the sky. He told them that the war was about to change. He told them that their breathing techniques were impressive, but they were fighting a war of attrition against an enemy that could not die. He offered them an alternative. He offered to teach them how to weaponize the laws of reality. But before they could answer, the ground shook. Not an earthquake, a drum. A rhythmic pounding coming from the dimensional breach. Strange recognized the frequency. It was the sound of the dimensional door opening, but not the one he had come through. This was a summoning. A lower moon demon had been deployed not to fight, but to act as a beacon. The sky tore open and demons began to fall like rain, not the mindless ones. These were modified, enhanced by the sudden influx of chaotic magical energy leaking from Strange's entry point. They were mutating in mid-air, growing armor, growing wings. The Hashira sprang into action, a blur of color and steel. Strange rose into the air, his cloak billowing. He realized that it was not just about arrival. It was about infection. His magic was leaking into this world, and the demons were feeding on it, evolving instantly. He had to clean up his own mess. He conjured the images of Icon, creating a dozen duplicates of himself to cover the perimeter. He shouted to Giyu to protect the master. The battle for the Slayer headquarters had begun, not at the end of the story, but at the beginning. And Stephen Strange realized with a sinking heart that he was the carrier of the plague that was making the monsters stronger. He ignited his hands with the mystic fire and prepared to conduct the surgery. The patient was the world, and the prognosis was terminal unless he operated immediately. The first wave of mutated demons hit the ground, and they did not scream. They chanted, They chanted in a language that Strange recognized from the Darkhold, a language that should not exist in this universe. Muzan was learning, fast. Strange cast a binding spell anchoring reality around the estate, but he felt the resistance. The universe was fighting him. He was a foreign body, and the immune system of reality was trying to expel him. He had to prove he was the cure, not the disease. He looked at the Hashira fighting below, their blades flashing against the horde. They were brave, they were skilled, and they were obsolete against what was coming. Strange made a decision. He would not just fight, he would integrate. He watched the flame, Hashira Rengoku, unleash a sea of fire. Strange mirrored the frequency, casting a spell that amplified Rengoku's flames, turning them from orange to a blinding white mystical fire that burned the souls of the demons, not just their flesh. Rengoku looked up, shocked by the sudden surge in power. Strange nodded to him. A silent alliance formed, magic and breath, the first step toward the new war. The courtyard in flames, the sky bleeding purple, and Dr. Strange floating in the center of the chaos, the conductor of a symphony of violence he had never intended to write. The breach sealed shut for now, but the damage was done. The demons had tasted magic, and they wanted more. The silence that followed the battle was heavier than the fighting. The Hashira stood amidst the dissolving bodies, breathing hard. They looked at Strange, not with trust, but with a terrifying realization of necessity. They needed him, and that was the most dangerous thing of all, because Stephen Strange knew that wherever he went, disaster followed. He looked at Kagaya, who was smiling through the pain. The master whispered that the gears of fate had turned. Strange corrected him. He said fate was just a construct, and he had just smashed it with a hammer. The sun began to rise, burning the remaining demon corpses. But the light felt different. It was paler, colder. Strange checked the eye of Agamotto again. The lid opened a fraction, just a slit, and inside he saw only fire. The first irreversible catastrophe had not been the breach. It had been the moment he offered to help. Because in the Demon Slayer universe, help always came with a price of blood, and the bill was already due. Strange landed, touching the scorched earth. He looked at his hands. They were shaking, not from nerve damage, but from fear. He was the Sorcerer Supreme, and he was terrified. The laboratory of the Butterfly Estate was usually a sanctuary of silence and sterile scents, but since the arrival of the Sorcerer Supreme, it had become a chaotic intersection of two conflicting sciences. Shinobu Kocho stood by her workbench, watching with a mixture of scientific curiosity and suppressed rage, as Stephen Strange dismantled the fundamental understanding of demon physiology she had spent her life compiling. The demon they had captured for study was strapped to a table of reinforced steel, its limbs thrashing against bindings that were not physical, but bands of glowing orange light that hummed with a low resonant frequency. Strange hovered inches above the floor, his cloak drifting lazily in a draft that didn't exist, while he manipulated a three-dimensional projection of the demon's cellular structure with his scarred hands. To Shinobu, the projection looked like a complex mandala of light, but Strange called it a bitemporal map. He was explaining that the cells were not just biological mutations, but localized pockets of arrested time where the entropy of the host had been paused and replaced by a parasitic energy source. Shinobu argued that it was a toxin, a biological agent derived from the blue spider lily, but Strange countered that the toxin was merely the physical anchor for a metaphysical tether. He rotated the hologram, revealing a thin, pulsing red line connecting the demon's heart to a vast darkness somewhere far to the north. Strange explained that this was a quantum entanglement line, a direct feed of power from the progenitor Muzan Kibutsuji, and that as long as this line remained intact, killing the body was merely pruning a leaf from a tree that had roots in hell. Shinobu felt a headache forming behind her eyes, because this man spoke of souls and dimensions with the arrogance of a surgeon who had never lost a patient, yet his hands shook when he wasn't weaving spells. She asked him if he could cut the line. Strange looked at her, his grey eyes somber and tired. He said he could, but the feedback might kill the host. Shinobu smiled her signature smile that didn't reach her eyes and said that the host was already dead and that she only cared about the method of excision. Strange frowned at her callousness, recognizing the armor of trauma she wore so tightly. He turned back to the demon and began to chant a low, guttural incantation that made the glass beakers on the shelves vibrate. The crimson bands tightened and the demon screamed a sound that was less like a vocalization and more like the tearing of metal. Strange was attempting a metaphysical severance, a surgical strike on the soul tether. Using the scalpel of Strange, a spell he had modified from the book of the Vishanti, he thrust his spectral hand into the demon's chest, bypassing skin and bone to grasp the red tether. The room temperature dropped 20 degrees instantly. Frost formed on Shinobu's butterfly ornament. Strange pulled. The tether snapped with the sound of a whip crack. The demon went rigid, its eyes rolling back, and for a moment, the monstrous features began to recede, the fangs retracting, the skin softening. Shinobu gasped, stepping forward. It was working. The biology was reverting. But then the universe corrected itself. The severed tether did not dissipate. It lashed out like a live wire seeking a ground. It struck the nearest source of magical density, which was Strange himself. The Sorcerer Supreme was thrown backwards, smashing through the sliding paper doors and into the courtyard. The demon on the table did not turn human. It exploded, not into gore but into a cloud of black corrosive mist that ate through the steel table and the floorboards, dissolving everything organic it touched. Strange recovered in midair, casting a shield of the seraphim to contain the blast, but the mist hissed against the golden energy eating at the divine geometry. He realized with horror that the demon blood had weaponized his own spell. By severing the link, he hadn't destroyed the energy, he had released it into a closed system that couldn't contain it. The mist dissipated only after consuming the table and a rack of medicinal herbs, leaving a crater in the floor that smelled of ozone and rotten wisteria. Shinobu stood on the edge of the crater, her haori singed. She looked at Strange not with anger, but with a terrifying validation. She noted that his magic acted as an accelerant, and that he had just turned a low-level threat into a biological bomb. Strange lowered his shield, landing softly on the grass. He admitted she was right. The physics of this dimension were more volatile than he had anticipated. The laws of conservation of energy here were ruthless. If he removed the demon nature, it had to go somewhere. It converted into pure destructive force. This was the first lesson. There would be no easy cures. Later that evening, Strange found himself in the training dojo, not as a teacher, but as a student. The stone Hashira Gyomei Himejima had requested his presence. The giant blind monk sat in the center of the sand garden, weeping silently while clapping his hands in a rhythm that Strange recognized as a somatic component. For a spell, but for Gyomei, it was just prayer. Gyomei told Strange that he carried the smell of 1,000 graveyards, and that his presence was disturbing the spirits of the mountain. Strange respected the monk's perception. He sat across from him and explained that he was trying to minimize his footprint. Gyomei shook his head. He said that a man who commands the storms cannot walk softly. He proposed a test. He wanted Strange to move a boulder, not with magic, but with breath. Strange found the request absurd. He was the Sorcerer Supreme, not a weightlifter. But he sensed the lesson beneath the request. He placed his hands on the massive stone, feeling the cold, rough granite. He tried to push. It didn't move. He channeled a low-level telekinetic tactile enhancement into his muscles. The rock moved easily. Guillaume struck the ground with his flail, stopping the rock instantly. He told Strange that he was cheating. He was using borrowed power. Strange argued that magic was his power. It was a discipline as rigorous as their swordsmanship. Guillaume disagreed. He said magic was negotiation with the universe, while breathing was a declaration of existence. He told Strange to stop asking the rock to move and to simply be the force that moves it. It was a semantic distinction that frustrated Strange's analytical mind. Tanjiro Kamado watched from the veranda, his eyes wide. The boy approached hesitantly, bowing low. He asked Strange if he could smell the opening thread on the rock. Strange looked at the boy. He activated the Eye of Agamotto, seeing the fault lines in reality, the stress points in the atomic structure of the stone. He saw 1,000 ways to shatter it. But Tanjiro wasn't talking about physics. He was talking about intuition. Strange realized that Tanjiro's smell was a crude form of precognition, a natural connection to the causal plane. Strange asked Tanjiro to demonstrate. The boy breathed deep, inhaling the oxygen into every cell of his body, his temperature rising. He didn't push the rock. He struck it at a single point of harmonic resonance. The boulder didn't move. It cracked down the center. Strange stared. It was the same principle as the shattered Sotarak bands, frequency matching. These warriors were unwitting masters of vibrational magic. Strange realized he couldn't just teach them spells. He had to translate his mystic arts into their somatic language. He stood up, brushing the sand from his knees. He told Tanjiro to come with him. If Strange couldn't cure the demons, maybe he could upgrade the Slayers. But this decision would lead to the first irreversible catastrophe. The upgrade began with the swords. The Nichirin blades were forged from ore that absorbed sunlight, but Strange saw them as rudimentary batteries. They held charge but couldn't shape it. He worked with the swordsmiths who had traveled from their hidden village, fascinated by the foreigner's ability to reshape metal without a hammer. Strange etched runes of the Vishanti into the steel of Tanjiro's blade. Microscopic inscriptions meant to channel and amplify the solar energy stored in the metal. He theorized that this would allow the blade to cut not just the flesh of a demon, but the astral tether he had seen earlier. He called it the Ghost Cutter. The test came 3 days later. A distress call arrived from a town in the east. A lower moon was suspected. Rengoku, the flame Hashira, was dispatched, and he requested Strange and Tanjiro to accompany him. Strange agreed, seeing it as a field test. They arrived at the town of Oak River at dusk. The atmosphere was wrong. The town wasn't under attack. It was silent. The streets were empty. The wisteria incense burners at the town gates were cold. Strange sensed the trap immediately. He cast the vapors of Valtor, creating a thick mist to cover their advance. But as the mist rolled through the streets, it turned color. It shifted from white to a sickly green. Rengoku drew his blade, the flames illuminating the fog. He shouted that the air was poison. Strange realized that the environment itself had been prepared for him. The demon waiting for them was not a lower moon. It was Akaza, the upper moon 3. He stood on a rooftop, looking down with his striped skin and golden eyes. He smiled at Strange. He said that man had told him about the wizard. He said, that man wanted to see if the wizard bled red or blue. Akaza didn't wait. He launched himself, creating a shockwave that flattened the building he had been standing on. Rengoku intercepted the blow, his sword meeting Akaza's fist in a collision of fire and martial force. Usually, this would be a stalemate, but Akaza's skin was glowing with faint purple geometries. He had evolved. He had absorbed the ambient magical radiation Strange had leaked during the estate battle. His compass needle technique was no longer just sensing battle spirit. It was sensing mana. He ducked under Rengoku's swing and punched the empty air. A shockwave of vacuum pressure hit Strange, knocking him out of the sky. Strange crashed into a storefront, shards of glass raining down. He groaned, realizing his auto-shields hadn't triggered because Akaza hadn't targeted him. Physically, he had targeted the space Strange occupied. A spatial attack. Upper Moon 3 was learning spatial magic through combat osmosis. Tanjiro charged, shouting the Hinokami Kagura, his blade burning with the new runic intensity. He swung at Akaza. The Ghost Cutter worked. The blade didn't just cut Akaza's arm, it severed the mana flow in the limb. The arm fell off and didn't regenerate immediately. Akaza looked at the stump surprised. Then he laughed. He said this was exciting. He regenerated the arm, but it took 3 seconds instead of 1. The runes were delaying the healing. It was a tactical advantage, but Strange knew about the cost. He saw the runes on Tanjiro's sword glowing brighter, getting hotter. The blade wasn't designed to channel that much multidimensional energy. Strange shouted for Tanjiro to stop, but the boy was locked in combat, driven by the need to protect Rengoku. Rengoku and Tanjiro fought in perfect synchronization, a storm of fire and sun. Strange supported them from the back lines, casting the 7 rings of Ragador to deflect Akaza's destructive death air punches. The battle was turning in their favor. The runic blade was slowing Akaza down. Rengoku prepared his final form, the 9th form Rengoku. A dragon of fire manifested. Tanjiro prepared his strike. They converged on Akaza. But Akaza didn't dodge. He slammed his foot down, deploying his compass needle to its maximum radius. And then he did something impossible. He reached out and grabbed the 7 rings of Ragador that Strange had cast. He didn't break them. He absorbed them. He pulled the magical energy into his own body, mixing it with his blood demon art. The purple tattoos on his body flared, turning a blinding white. He screamed in pain and power. He unleashed a shockwave that wasn't just physical force. It was a chaotic discharge of raw, unrefined magic. The blast radius was devastating. It stripped the flesh from the buildings and pulverized the street. Rengoku was blown back, his internal organs ruptured. Tanjiro was thrown into a wall, his runic sword shattering into 1,000 pieces. Strange shielded himself, but the feedback knocked the wind out of him. He looked up through the dust. Akaza was standing there smoking. His arm was gone, blown off by his own overload, but he was smiling. He looked at Strange and said, "Thank you for the meal." Then he vanished, retreating into the night, leaving the town in ruins. But the catastrophe wasn't the escape of the demon. It was what happened next. Strange rushed to Tanjiro. The boy was alive, but his hands were burned black. Not by fire, but by the handle of his sword. The runes had overloaded. The solar energy had discharged into Tanjiro's nervous system. Strange tried to heal him using a time reversal spell on the tissue, but the damage resisted. It was magical burnout. Tanjiro's hands were trembling uncontrollably. He couldn't hold a sword. Strange looked at Rengoku. The flame Hashira was coughing blood, smiling despite the pain. He told Strange not to worry about the town. But Strange looked around. The civilians who had been hiding in the cellars, they weren't coming out. Strange expanded his astral senses. He felt silence. He ran to the nearest cellar and tore the door open. The people inside were alive, but they were catatonic. Their eyes were open and blank. The shockwave of raw magic combined with Akaza's demon aura had short-circuited their minds. They were trapped in a permanent waking nightmare. Strange fell to his knees. He had tried to upgrade the war, and instead he had created a weapon that the enemy had turned against the innocent. The ghost cutter experiment was a failure. The runic magic was too volatile for this world's materials. And worse, Akaza now knew how to eat magic. Strange had just fed the sharks. Back at the butterfly estate, the mood was funereal. Tanjiro's hands were bandaged. Shinobu said he might never hold a katana again with the same grip. The nerves were fried. Strange stood in the corner, ostracized by the very people he tried to help. He had saved Rengoku's life. The Hashira would have died without the shields, but the cost was the town's sanity and Tanjiro's potential. Sanemi spat on the ground near Strange's feet as he walked past. He said nothing, but the message was clear. You are the poison. Kagaya Uboyoshiki summoned Strange that night. The master looked worse, the curse spreading faster. He told Strange that the report had come in. Demons across the country were changing. They were becoming resistant to wisteria. The incident with Akaza had sent a ripple through the connection. Muzan had distributed the antibody to magic. The wisteria flowers, which had protected humanity for centuries, were beginning to wilt. The natural barrier was failing. Strange realized the scale of his error. He had introduced a pathogen, magic, into a sterile environment. The ecosystem was collapsing. He told Kagaya he would leave. He would go to the mirror dimension and seal himself away. Kagaya shook his head. He said it was too late. The door was open. If Strange left now, humanity would be slaughtered by the magic-enhanced demons. Strange had to stay. He had to fix it, but he couldn't use his magic the way he used to. He had to find a new way, a synthesis. Strange looked at his shaking hands. He had to become something else. He had to stop being a Sorcerer Supreme and become a demon slayer. But a slayer who used the fabric of reality as his blade. A shot of the Infinity Fortress. Muzan sat on a throne of shifting rooms. In his hand, he held a shard of Tanjiro's shattered runic sword. He brought it to his lips and tasted the metal. He smiled. He felt the taste of a galaxy. He felt the taste of the time-stone residue. Muzan's eyes glowed not red, but a swirling, chaotic green. He whispered to the empty air, "Doctor." The war had shifted. It was no longer about survival. It was about consumption, and the Sorcerer Supreme was the main course. The irreversible catastrophe was complete. The demons had adapted to the mystic arts, effectively neutralizing the Slayer's greatest advantages: stealth, wisteria, and the predictability of their enemy. The board was reset, and the pieces were all in the wrong places. Strange walked out into the garden of the butterfly estate. He took off his cloak of levitation. He folded it neatly. He needed to learn to walk on the ground before he could fly again. He picked up a wooden training sword. It felt dead in his hands, but he squeezed it until the wood groaned. He would learn. He would adapt, or they would all die. This was his penance. This was his war now. The mountain air was thin and bit at the lungs with the sharpness of shattered glass, a constant reminder that in this universe, breath was not an autonomic function, but a weapon that required constant conscious maintenance. Stephen Strange stood waist deep in a freezing waterfall, the water pounding against his shoulders with enough force to bruise, but he did not conjure a shield to deflect it, nor did he cast a warming charm to regulate his body temperature. He was stripping himself of the reliance on external mana, forcing his physiology to adapt to the brutal laws of the Demon Slayer core. because his magic had become a liability rather than an asset. Every time he reached for the ambient energy of the universe, he felt the sickening lurch of the local reality resisting him, a sensation akin to pulling a muscle that had atrophied. The failure at Oak River had been a diagnostic clarity that his arrogance could not ignore, because the demons were evolving faster than he could reinvent the mystic arts, so he had to descend to the level of biology. Giyu Tomioka sat on a moss-covered rock nearby, watching the Sorcerer Supreme shiver with the impassive judgment of a stone statue, his silence louder than any reprimand. Strange was attempting to learn. Total concentration, breathing, constant. A technique that required maintaining a hyper-oxygenated state 24 hours a day, even while sleeping, a feat that demanded a level of physical discipline Strange had not needed since his hands were crushed in the car accident. He inhaled, trying to guide the oxygen into the bloodstream to trigger the cellular excitation Giyu had demonstrated. But his mind automatically tried to shape the breath into a spell incantation, converting the physical resource into metaphysical potential, which was exactly what he needed to stop doing. Giyu threw a pebble. It struck Strange's forehead with stinging precision, breaking his concentration. Giyu stated calmly that Strange was still trying to negotiate with the water instead of becoming it. Strange gasped, spitting out water, and argued that his neural pathways were hardwired for complex geometric visualization, not somatic simplicity. Giyu replied that there was nothing simple about keeping one's heart from exploding while moving faster than sound. Strange closed his eyes again, visualizing his lungs, not as bellows for magic, but as the primary engine of his existence, trying to find the rhythm that Tanjiro had described the opening thread of the body. He focused on the memory of the Ancient One pushing his astral form out of his physical body, but inverted the process, forcing his consciousness deeper into the marrow of his bones. He felt a flicker of heat, a spark in the solar plexus that wasn't mana, but raw biological combustion. He seized it, feeding it oxygen, and the water around him hissed, turning to steam, not from a spell, but from the sudden spike in his body temperature. Giyu nodded once, a microscopic approval. This was the birth of a new discipline, not a breathing style derived from the elements like water or flame, but one derived from the void between dimensions. Strange was developing breath of the mystic, a style that utilized the practitioner's body as a containment vessel for cosmic residue, recycling the waste energy of the universe into physical enhancement. The strategic landscape of Japan was deteriorating with terrifying speed as the consequences of the magical infection spread through the ecosystem. Reports were arriving at the Ubuyashiki estate that the wisteria flowers, the natural repellent that had saved humanity for centuries, were turning black and rotting on the vine, their essential oils curdling into a neurotoxin that affected humans but strengthened demons. The biological balance had tipped because the demons, having tasted the high-frequency energy of the Sorcerer Supreme, were now metabolizing the very things that used to hurt them. The Hashira meeting was a cacophony of accusation and panic held in the semi-darkness of the Master's receiving room, where the shadows seemed to stretch longer than physics allowed. Sanemi Shinazugawa was pacing like a caged tiger, his scars livid in the dim light, accusing Strange of being a plague carrier who should be executed before he contaminated the rest of the core. Obanai Iguro agreed his snake, hissing in agitation, stating that since the foreigner arrived, the demons had stopped acting like predators and started acting like an army. They were coordinating. They were using ambush tactics that targeted the Slayer's specific breathing weaknesses. Strange stood in the center of the room, wearing the standard corps uniform, which felt alien and restrictive compared to his tunic, though he had kept the cloak of levitation folded into a scarf around his neck. He did not defend himself with arrogance this time. He laid out the tactical reality with the cold precision of a surgeon declaring a patient terminal. He explained that Muzan Kibutsuji had tapped into the multiversal ley lines via the curse link and was effectively downloading genetic adaptations from alternate timelines where demons had no weaknesses. The wisteria was dying because the demons were emitting a low-level radiation that inverted the flower's life cycle. Strange proposed a radical solution, a counter-offensive that required them to abandon the defensive perimeter of the wisteria and strike at the source of the adaptation. He revealed that he had tracked the energy signature of the patient zero demon who was broadcasting the anti-magic signal. It wasn't Muzan himself, but a proxy, a biotower located in the swordsmith village. The Hashira fell silent. The location of the village was the corps' most guarded secret. If the demons were there, the war was already lost, because without the Nichirin swords, the Slayers would just meet. Strange explained that the demons weren't attacking the village to destroy it. They were attacking to seize the ore. They wanted to forge weapons of their own. The journey to the swordsmith village was not undertaken by train or foot, but through a desperate stealth maneuver, utilizing the last remnants of Strange's cloaking magic, which he could only sustain by burning his own life force as fuel. He traveled with Tanjiro, whose hands were still wrapped in bandages, the nerves slowly regenerating thanks to Shinobu's experimental medicine, and the mist Hashira, Muichiro, Tokito, whose apathy masked a terrifying perceptiveness. They moved through the dense forests of the mountain range, where the air was heavy with the scent of ozone and sulfur, a clear indicator that the localized reality was warping. Tanjiro sniffed the air, his expression tightening as he whispered that the smell was wrong, that it smelled like the inside of a mirror. Strange realized with a sinking heart that Gyoko the Upper Moon 5 had not just infiltrated the Volis Ermnitej. He had terraformed it. They arrived at the village perimeter at midnight expecting to see flames, but saw only silence and a distortion in the air like heat haze over asphalt. The village was there, but it was out of focus. Strange extended his hand touching the barrier. It wasn't a wall. It was a spatial loop. Gyoko had encased the entire valley in a pocket dimension. Strange looked at Muichiro, telling him that once they crossed the threshold, the laws of physics would be subjective, and that up might be down. Muichiro looked at the clouds and said it didn't matter as long as he could cut. They stepped through the distortion, and the world inverted. The sky was a checkered floor of water, and the ground was a ceiling of stone pots. The village houses were floating in spiraling clusters connected by bridges of liquid mercury. This was not just a blood demon art. It was a crude imitation of the mirror dimension constructed by a creature who had seen Strange's mind during the brief psychic backlash at the estate. Gyoko emerged from a pot that floated upside down his grotesque body, twisting with new appendages that gleamed with metallic luster. He laughed, a sound that distorted into multiple frequencies, welcoming the artist who had inspired his new masterpiece. He boasted that he had transcended art and become an architect of reality. The battle that ensued was a chaotic collision of incompatible systems, where gravity was a suggestion and geometry was a weapon. Muichiro engaged Gyoko, moving with the fluid logic of the mist-breathing style disappearing into the condensation clouds, only to realize that the mist was being refracted by Gyoko's spatial pots, turning the Hashira's own cover against him. Strange realized he could not fight Gyoko with spatial magic, because Gyoko was controlling the container they were in, so he had to break the container. He drew the wooden training sword he had carried since the estate, a useless stick against a demon, unless one knew how to channel the breath of the mystic. Strange closed his eyes, ignoring the vertigo of the floating village, and inhaled the distorted atmosphere filtering the corrupted mana through his lungs. He visualized the wooden sword as a key of Agamotto. He executed the first form, crimson bands of containment, not as a spell, but as a sword strike. He swung the wood, and a shockwave of red kinetic energy slammed into the structural integrity of the pocket dimension. The sky cracked like porcelain. Gyoko shrieked in outrage as his masterpiece fractured the pots, shattering under the pressure of the forced normalization of physics. The village crashed back into reality, gravity reasserting itself with bone-breaking suddenness. The houses splintered as they hit the ground, and the slayers landed in the debris ready to kill. But the threat was not just Gyoko. From the shadows of the forge emerged a figure that radiated a sorrow so deep it felt like drowning. Hunting the Upper Moon Four crouched weeping, but his aura was different. He wasn't just splitting into his emotions. He was manifesting tulpa psychic constructs formed from the collective fear of the villagers. A dragon of pure wood and hatred. Zohakuten rose behind him. But this dragon had eyes of the eye of Agamotto, dozens of them glowing green embedded in its wooden scales. Strange realized Hunting had absorbed the residual temporal energy Strange had leaked. The dragon roared and time skipped. Strange found himself standing 3 seconds in the past, the dragon's attack already hitting him before he saw it start. He was thrown through a wall, his ribs cracking. The time skip was short but lethal. Hunting was stuttering time, creating micro-loops where the slayers were trapped in repetitive failures. Tanjiro dragged Strange from the rubble, his nose bleeding from the temporal pressure. He shouted that they couldn't predict the attacks because the attacks were happening before the cause. Strange coughed blood, his mind racing. He needed a counter-frequency. He needed a weapon that existed outside of linear time. They needed to reach the chief of the village Tekin, Tekikawahara, but the forge was surrounded by Huntengu's emotion clones, which were now armored in localized time dilation fields, making them move with blinding speed. Strange looked at Tanjiro and Michiro and the love Hashira Mitsuri Kanroji, who had just arrived, her whipsword snapping through the air. Strange told them to buy him 5 minutes. He needed to get to the main forge. He wasn't going to fight the demons. He was going to make a tool. Mitsuri smiled, crying out that she would protect him with all her heart, and launched herself at the hatred dragon, her sword bending around the time skips with the flexibility of love which apparently defied temporal logic. Strange sprinted toward the forge, dodging bolts of lightning and sonic screams, using short-range teleports that left him nauseous. He crashed into the forge where Haganezuka was polishing a blade with a maniacal focus, ignoring the apocalypse outside. The swordsmith didn't look up even as Strange slammed the door shut and barred it with a spell of sealing. Strange grabbed the billet of raw Nichirin ore. It was cold and heavy. He looked at Haganezuka and shouted that they needed to forge a sword not for a slayer, but for a sorcerer. Haganezuka stopped polishing and looked at Strange, his mask hiding his expression, but his intensity palpable. He asked if the foreigner could hammer with the rhythm of the sun. Strange said he would hammer with the rhythm of the stars. The forging process was a violation of metallurgy and thermodynamics. Strange heated the forge not with coal, but with the flames of the Faltine stripping the magical fire of its offensive properties and concentrating it into pure thermal intensity. The iron turned white instantly. Haganazuka hammered with a speed that blurred his hands, and Strange hammered in between the strikes, using his telekinesis to strike the metal from the inside, aligning the molecular structure into a lattice capable of holding multidimensional energy. But the metal was resisting. It was too terrestrial. It couldn't hold the charge of the Vishanti. Strange made a choice that would permanently alter his status as the Sorcerer Supreme. He took the eye of Agamotto from his neck. The casing was cracked, the mechanism jammed. He couldn't open it to use the time stone, but he could use the casing, the housing that had held an infinity stone for millennia. It was saturated with temporal radiation. Strange smashed the eye of Agamotto onto the anvil. The gold shattered, mixing with the white-hot Nichirin steel. Haganazuka screamed in horror at the destruction of the relic, but he didn't stop hammering, folding the divine metal into the ore. The sword began to hum. It didn't glow red or blue. It turned a deep, infinite black, a void that absorbed the light of the fire. This was the singularity blade, a weapon that didn't cut matter, but severed the space matter occupied. Strange grabbed the hilt while it was still red-hot, his flesh sizzling, but he pushed the pain into a mental box and poured his soul into the steel. He felt the connection instantly. The sword wasn't a tool. It was a prosthetic limb for his magic. Outside, the battle was lost. Muichiro was pinned to a tree by wooden spikes, his mist dispersed. Mitsuri was buried under a pile of debris, her stamina exhausted by the time skips. Tanjiro was fighting Zohakuten alone, his dance of the fire god, the only thing keeping the dragon at bay, but he was slowing down, his scars tearing open. Hunting laughed a sound of pure neurotic triumph, preparing to unleash a final sonic scream that would liquefy the organs of every living thing in the valley. The door of the forge exploded outward, not from a blast but from a sudden vacuum. Stephen Strange stepped out. He didn't look like a wizard. He wore the tattered remains of the corps uniform, his cloak tied around his waist like a sash, the black blade in his hand swallowing the moonlight. He didn't cast a spell. He didn't recite an incantation. He breathed. Breath of the mystic second form. Event horizon. He slashed the air horizontally. There was no sound. The sonic scream that Hunting unleashed simply ceased to exist as it hit the path of the blade. The sound waves were deleted. Strange walked forward, the black blade trailing a wake of darkness that looked like ink in water. Zohakuten roared and summoned a forest of wooden dragons to crush the intruder. Strange didn't dodge. He swung the blade in a vertical arc. The dragons didn't break. They fell apart into two-dimensional cross-sections, sliding off each other like sliced paper. The blade had removed the third dimension from the wood. Strange was now wielding the concept of the mirror dimension as a physical edge. He moved with a speed that wasn't super speed, but space folding, stepping from point A to point B, without crossing the distance in between. He appeared in front of Hunting. The demon's eyes widened in genuine fear, the first time an upper moon had felt terror since Yorichi. Hantengu tried to shrink to hide in the grass, but Strange's sword pinned his shadow to the ground. The blade had cut the shadow, detaching it from the light. Hanteng was paralyzed. Strange raised the blade for the execution, but the universe demanded balance. As Strange prepared to end the upper moon, the sky above the village tore open. It wasn't a portal. It was a summon. A giant hand made of flesh and eyes reached down from the clouds, crushing the barrier Strange had destroyed earlier. It was the Infinity Castle. Nakime, the Biwa woman, had located them. The castle was manifesting in the physical world, overriding the landscape. The gravity shifted again. The village was being pulled up into the dimensional fortress. Strange realized that this was a retrieval operation. Muzan didn't want the village destroyed. He wanted the smiths. He wanted the one who could forge a gun that shot magic. Strange looked at the unconscious swordsmiths at the wounded Hashira. He could kill Huntengu, but if he did, the village would be absorbed, and the knowledge of the Nichirin creation would belong to the demons. He had to choose victory or rescue. He cursed the moral compass of a hero. He sheathed the singularity blade, the sudden cessation of its power causing a thunderclap. He clapped his hands together, casting the images of Icon not to fight, but to confuse the castle's senses. Dozens of illusionary villages appeared. The giant hand hesitated, grasping at phantoms. Strange grabbed Tanjiro and Mitsuri, telekinetically pulling them to him. He shouted for Michiru to grab the smiths. They had to retreat. They had to abandon the village. Huntengu scrambled away, scurrying up the floating debris into the safety of the Infinity Castle. The demons had won the objective. They had the ground. Strange opened a portal not to the estate, but to a random location in the mountains, a desperate blind jump. As they fell through the spark ring, Strange looked back. He saw the swordsmith village being pulled piece by piece into the chaotic geometry of the Infinity Fortress. And standing on one of the floating platforms watching them flee was a figure with 6 eyes and a purple haori. Kokushibo, the upper moon one. He didn't attack. He just watched Strange with a look of recognition. He saw the way Strange moved. He saw the black sword, and he reached for his own blade, a fleshy monstrosity covered in eyes. The connection was made. The strongest swordsman of the demon world had found a rival who wasn't a swordsman at all. The escape was messy. They crashed into a rice paddy miles away, the portal collapsing behind them. Strange lay in the mud, clutching the black sword, his chest heaving. He had failed to save the village. The production of Nichirin swords was now halted. The core had lost its supply line, but he had the prototype. He looked at the blade. It was humming, hungry for more mana. Strange realized that he hadn't just forged a weapon. He had forged a curse. The blade would feed on him until there was nothing left. Tanjiro crawled over to him, tears streaming down his face. He asked about the villagers. Strange lied. He said some might have escaped, but he knew the truth. They were in the castle now, slaves to the forge of hell. A terrifying systemic shift. The demons now controlled the means of production, and the slayers were left with a broken organization, a dying ecosystem, and a Sorcerer Supreme who was slowly turning into a living battery for a sword that wanted to eat the world. The escalation was complete. The war had moved from the shadows to the industrial scale, and in the distance, the sound of a biwa echoed, signaling the beginning of the final hunt. Strange stood up, cleaning the mud from the singularity blade. He looked at the moon. It looked like an eye, and it was blinking. The provisional headquarters of the Demon Slayer Corps was a series of abandoned caves, high in the misty peaks of Mount Kumatori, chosen not for comfort, but for their geological density, which Dr. Strange theorized might mask their thermal and magical signatures from Nakimi's omnipresent eye. The damp cold of the caves seeped into the bones of the surviving Hashira, who sat around a fire that burned with blue, smokeless magical flames, a minor spell Strange had cast to conserve oxygen. The mood was not one of determination, but of a grim existential calculation, because the loss of the swordsmith village had effectively put an expiration date on their war. Every chipped blade, every broken tip, and every stress fracture in their steel was now permanent, and a slayer without a sword was just a highly trained meal. Stephen Strange sat apart from them, polishing the obsidian surface of the singularity blade, which seemed to drink the light of the fire, leaving a void in the visual field. The sword was hungry, and Strange could feel it pulling at his own bioelectric field. demanding a tithe of mana that left his hands trembling with a distinct neurological tremor. He looked at the Hashira and saw the desperation etched into their faces. Not fear of death, but fear of irrelevance. They were warriors who had been disarmed by logistics. Strange knew he had to offer them a solution, but the only solution he had left was a violation of the natural order, a crossing of a line that the Ancient One had drawn centuries ago. He stood up, the black sword humming as it moved through the magnetic field of the cave. He told them that steel was no longer enough. He explained that their enemies were no longer just biological anomalies. They were metaphysical constructs fueled by his own leaked energy, and to fight them, the Slayers had to become conduits themselves. He proposed a ritual. He called it the Rite of the Icon, a binding spell that would link their souls directly to the source of their breathing styles, converting their very life force into a solid-state projection. They would not need swords, because they would become the swords. Their arms would manifest blades of pure focused will, capable of cutting through the reinforced necks of the evolved demons. But the cost was severe. It would bypass the safety limits of the human body. It was essentially a permanent activation of the Slayer, Mark accelerating their death clocks, not to 25 years, but to weeks or perhaps days. It was a suicide pact disguised as a power-up. Gyome Himejima, the stone Hashira, was the first to speak, his blind eyes weeping tears that turned to steam before they hit his lap. He asked if this path would allow them to kill Muzan. Strange answered truthfully that it gave them a non-zero probability, which was infinitely higher than their current zero. Sanemi Shinazugawa laughed a harsh sound that echoed in the cavern and ripped the bandages from his chest, exposing his scars. He said he didn't care if he burned out in an hour, as long as he took the upper moons with him. The consensus was swift and terrifying. They accepted. Strange arranged them in a circle, the geometry precise and aligned with the cardinal directions of the cave. He stood in the center, floating cross-legged, and began the incantation. It was not a spell of protection, but of unlocking. He used the singularity blade as the focus point, channeling the ambient mana of the mountain through his body and into the Slayers. The air in the cave grew heavy, smelling of ozone and burning iron. The Slayers screamed not in pain, but in the shock of expansion as their souls were forcibly dilated. Strange watched as their auras flared, becoming visible to the naked eye. Sanemi's wind turned into jagged blades of green light extending from his forearms. Gyome's spirit manifested as a heavy, crushing gravity field that cracked the stone floor. Muikiro's mist became a solid obscurant, making him fade in and out of reality. Tanjiro, who sat by the entrance guarding the right, watched in horror and awe as his friends were transformed into living weapons. Strange felt a tear in his own psyche as the spell locked into place. He had connected their minds to his, creating a tactical hive mind to counter Muzan's network. He could feel their rage, their trauma, and their resolve. But he also felt the inevitable burnout. He had just lit the fuses of 8 human bombs. This was the small choice: to sacrifice the longevity of the few for the survival of the many. He did not know that by linking their souls to the mystic arts, he had inadvertently turned them into beacons that shone across the multiverse. The assault on the Infinity Castle did not begin with a stealth insertion, but with a breach of violent directness. Strange used the singularity blade to cut a hole in reality right above the dimensional coordinates of the fortress. They didn't fall in, they descended like a meteor shower of magic and flesh. The castle reacted instantly. The gravity shifted the endless tatami rooms, rotating like the tumblers of a cosmic lock. But the Slayers were no longer bound by physics. They were anchored to Strange's levitation spell, moving through the chaotic geometry with the freedom of flight. The demons that swarmed them were slaughtered not by steel, but by the projected energy blades. Sanemi sliced through a horde of lower-ranked demons with a wave of his arm, the wind pressure alone disintegrating them. It was a massacre. The power imbalance had flipped. The Slayers were tearing through the castle with the ferocity of gods. Strange floated in the center of the formation, the conductor of the violence monitoring the heart rates and mana levels of his team. He felt a surge of pride, a tactical satisfaction that masked the moral rot of what he had done. They were winning. They pushed deep into the fortress, bypassing the labyrinthine traps, simply by smashing through the walls. But the Infinity Castle was not just a building, it was a living extension of Nakimi, and she was learning. Strange felt the shift in the air a split second before it happened. The castle stopped rotating. The rooms locked into a tesseract configuration. The hive mind connection flickered. Strange looked up and saw him, standing on a platform that defied gravity upside down. Relative to them was Kokushibo, the Upper Moon One. But he was different. He wasn't just holding his flesh katana. He was holding a book with a cover made of dark leather that Strange recognized with a jolt of nausea. It was a page from the Darkhold, a loose page that must have drifted through the initial breach. Kokushibo had found it, and he had read it. The 6 eyes of the demon swordsman glowed with a new color, a bruised violet that matched the energy of the dark dimension. He didn't draw his sword immediately. He looked at Strange and spoke, his voice echoing from every direction at once. He commended the sorcerer for the upgrade he had given the cattle. He said it made the harvest more interesting. Then he read a syllable from the page. It wasn't Japanese, it was Sumerian. A word of power, shatter. The hive mind link that Strange had forged didn't break. It resonated. A feedback loop of psychic pain slammed into every Hashira simultaneously. They screamed, clutching their heads, falling out of the air. Strange gasped, blood pouring from his nose as the mental backlash hit him. Kokushibo had hijacked the network. He wasn't attacking their bodies. He was attacking the magical frequency Strange had used to bind them. Strange realized with horror that Kokushibo had analyzed the magical syntax of the universe just by observing Strange's previous battles. The demon was a savant of slaughter capable of adapting to any system of violence. Strange hastily erected a mental firewall isolating the Hashira from the feedback, but the damage was done. They were disoriented, their formations broken. Kokushibo drew his blade, and the moon-breathing technique he unleashed was not just crescents of chaotic blades. It was crescents of eldritch fire. Moon-breathing 16th form. Moonbow. Half moon. Cthulhu's orbit. The attack was a wash of purple energy that warped the space it traveled through. Guillaume stepped forward, swinging his flail, which was now a wrecking ball of pure golden force, to intercept the attack. The impact was silent. The energy didn't collide. It cancelled out, creating a void sphere that ate a chunk of the castle. Guillaume was thrown back, his stone skin cracking. Kokushibo descended, stepping on the air as if it were stairs. He targeted Muyero, who was trying to reform his mist body. Strange intervened, teleporting between the demon and the boy, raising the singularity blade. The black sword met the flesh sword. The clash of the two blades caused a phenomenon that neither universe was prepared for. The singularity blade was a shard of the mirror dimension. Kokushibo's blade was now infused with Darkhold magic. When they touched, they created a bridge. A momentary rift between the mirror dimension and the dark dimension. A shockwave of kaleidoscopic fractals exploded outward, turning the surrounding tatami mats into glass and the air into crystal. Strange and Kokushibo were locked in a stalemate of strength and metaphysics. Strange looked into the six eyes and saw no soul, only a hunger for perfection that had consumed everything else. Kokushibo smiled, revealing fangs that were etched with runes. He asked Strange if he knew what happened when a breathing style consumed a spell. Strange didn't answer. He rotated his wrist, attempting to trap the demon in a loop of icon. But Kokushibo moved his blade in a pattern that cut the loop. He cut the time loop. Strange's eyes widened. This was the escalation he had feared. The demons weren't just using magic. They were deconstructing it. Kokushibo kicked Strange in the chest, a blow that shattered the ribs of the seraphim's shield Strange had instinctively raised. Strange flew backward, crashing through 3 walls of the castle before coming to a stop in a garden that grew upside down. He coughed, trying to refill his lungs, but the air in the castle was becoming thin. It was being sucked out. Strange looked up. The rift they had created wasn't closing. It was growing. A tear in the fabric of the castle that looked out into a swirling purple void. Dormammu's domain. Strange realized that the Darkhold page was a beacon. Kokushibo was trying to summon the Dread One, not to serve him but to challenge him, to fight him. The arrogance of the samurai knew no bounds. Meanwhile, the other Hashira were fighting for their lives against the geography of the castle itself. Nakime was playing her biwa with frantic intensity, shifting the rooms to separate the slayers. Tanjiro found himself isolated in a corridor of endless doors. He could smell the blood of his friends, but he couldn't reach them. He gripped the phantom hilt of his projected sword, his hands burning with the strain of the magic. He realized that Strange's gift was eating him alive. His vision was blurring, the edges of the world turning grey. He had to finish this quickly. He smelled a thread. Not an opening thread for an attack, but a navigational thread. A scent of wisteria and medicine. Shinobu. He sprinted, following the scent. He found her in a large hall facing Doma, the Upper Moon too. But Shinobu was not fighting. She was floating, held aloft by butterfly wings of purple energy that Strange's ritual had manifested. She looked angelic and terrifying. Doma was clapping his hands, delighted by the new biology of his favorite plaything. He sent a wave of ice lotuses at her. Shinobu didn't dodge. She flew through them, her energy wings melting the ice instantly. She thrust her hand forward, her fingers extended like a blade. Insect breathing, dance of the centipede, astral sting. She passed through Doma's body, not cutting him but phasing through him. Doma stopped, his smile freezing. He looked down at his chest. There was no wound, but then he coughed, and what came out was not blood but purple smoke. Strange's magic had allowed Shinobu to deliver her poison directly into the demon's spiritual core, bypassing the physical metabolism. Doma fell to his knees, his regeneration failing because his soul was being poisoned. It was a victory, but as Shinobu landed, she collapsed, her legs giving out. The magic had taken the calcium from her bones to fuel the flight. She lay on the floor, unable to move, smiling as Doma began to dissolve. She had won, but she was broken. Strange pulled himself out of the garden debris. He had to close the rift. If Dormammu entered the Infinity Castle, the Demon Slayer universe would be consumed in seconds. He looked at the singularity blade. It was vibrating violently, reacting to the proximity of the dark dimension. Strange realized the sword was a key. He could use it to lock the door, but he needed to be at the center of the rift, and Kokushibo was standing right in front of it, guarding the gateway to hell like a sentinel. Strange stood up, wiping the blood from his mouth. He tapped into the comms link he had established with the Hashira. He spoke to all of them. He told them to brace themselves. He was going to invert the gravity of the entire castle. He didn't wait for a response. He slammed the singularity blade into the ground. Breath of the mystic final form. Axis Mundi. He grabbed the ley lines of the pocket dimension and twisted them. The infinity castle groaned, the wood screamed, and then the entire fortress flipped inside out. The ceiling became the floor, the walls became the sky. The demons lost their footing, falling into the chaotic sky. The slayers, anchored by Strange's spell, held their ground. Kokushibo stumbled, his concentration broken for a fraction of a second. That was all Strange needed. He flew forward using the cloak of levitation to reach Mach speed in the confined space. He didn't slash at Kokushibo. He tackled him. He drove the upper moon one backward into the purple rift. They tumbled into the void between dimensions. The cold of the dark dimension hit them instantly, absolute zero that froze the sweat on Strange's skin. Kokushibo looked around, his eyes widening at the sight of the dark planets and the swirling nebulas of mindless ones. He didn't look afraid. He looked fascinated. He raised his sword to strike Strange. Strange parried with the singularity blade, the impact creating a shockwave that attracted the attention of the geometric entities floating in the distance. Strange grabbed Kokushibo's collar. He told the demon that this was what happened when you played with gods. Kokushibo sneered and replied that he saw no gods, only bigger demons. He headbutted Strange, his three eyes flashing. Strange reeled back, floating in the zero gravity. He realized he couldn't kill Kokushibo here. The demon would adapt to the dark dimension. He would become a herald of Dormammu. Strange had to take him back, but he had to leave something behind to seal the rift. He looked at the singularity blade, the weapon he had forged from the eye of Agamotto's casing. It was the only thing dense enough to plug the hole. Strange made the choice. He threw the sword, not at Kokushibo, but at the tear in reality they had fallen through. The sword spun end over end, embedding itself in the fabric of the portal. The temporal energy in the casing detonated. A localized time dilation field expanded, freezing the portal in a moment of eternal closure. The rift began to seal. Strange grabbed Kokushibo's ankle and activated his sling ring, which was sputtering in the anti-magic atmosphere. He visualized the castle. He pulled. They shot back through the closing gap just as it snapped shut. They crashed back into the infinity castle, landing hard on the ceiling, which was now the floor. The singularity blade was gone, lost in the dark dimension, sacrificing the only weapon capable of killing Muzan to prevent a worse invasion. Strange stood up empty-handed. Kokushibo stood up. He was missing an arm severed by the portal's closure, but he was regenerating, and he was angry. The castle stabilized, Nakime regaining control. Strange looked around. The Hashira were scattered, injured, exhausted. Shinobu was incapacitated. Yomei was cracking. The surprise attack had failed to decapitate the leadership, and Strange had lost his sword. But the massive multiversal outcome was not the loss of the sword. It was what happened to the magic. Strange felt a shift in the atmosphere. The portal closure hadn't just sealed the rift. It had pressurized the castle. The magic Strange had released, the magic the Slayers were using was now trapped in a closed system, with nowhere to vent. The air began to sparkle with wild magic. The demons breathing it in began to change again. Not evolution, distortion. Their forms became unstable, glitching like bad code. And the Slayers too. Strange looked at Sanemi. The wind, Hashira's arm, wasn't just glowing. It was turning into wind, literally dissolving into elemental energy. The rite of Icon was runaway. Without the singularity blade to regulate the flow, the Slayers were becoming pure elementals. They were losing their physical forms. Strange realized with horror that he hadn't just shortened their lives. He was erasing their humanity. He had turned them into jinn. Sanemi looked at his hand, which was now a swirling vortex, and laughed. A sound that had no vocal cords. He threw a punch and a hurricane destroyed a quarter of the castle. It was raw power, uncontrollable, dangerous. Kokushibo watched this transformation warily. He sensed that the rules of combat had dissolved. These weren't swordsmen anymore. They were natural disasters. Strange shouted for them to stop to control their breathing, but they couldn't hear him. The power was too intoxicating. The human mind was not meant to channel the storm directly. Muzan's voice boomed through the castle, amplified by the architecture. He sounded amused. He thanked the doctor for the final experiment. He said he had always wanted to know if humans could transcend flesh. Now he knew, and he would consume that too. The floor beneath them opened up, not a door, but a mouth. A giant maw of flesh formed from the castle's foundation. It swallowed the chaotic Hashira and the glitching demons, plunging them down toward the deepest level of the fortress. Strange tried to fly, but the wild magic disrupted his levitation. He fell. As he fell into the dark, he realized the scope of his failure. He had tried to bridge the gap between anime and comic power systems, and instead, he had created a singularity that was destroying the definitions of both. The strange falling into the abyss surrounded by friends who were becoming storms and enemies who were becoming eldritch horrors. The screen faded to black, not with silence, but with the sound of a Geiger counter clicking rapidly, indicating that the reality radiation had reached critical mass. The Demon Slayer core was gone. What remained was the elemental core, and they were just as likely to destroy the world as save it. The descent into the abyss of the Infinity Castle was not a fall through space, but a plunge through the digestive tract of a living dimension, where the walls pulsed with the heartbeat of Muzan Kibutsuji, and the air was thick with the digestive enzymes of a reality that had learned to eat magic. Stephen Strange tumbled through the darkness, his cloak of levitation shredded and lifeless, a mere rag of red fabric flapping against the gale force winds generated by the dissolution of Sanemi Shinazugawa. The wind, Hashira had ceased to be a man with scars and a sword, and had become a sentient typhoon, a chaotic spiral of green wind blades that shredded the falling debris, and the unfortunate demons sucked into his orbit. Strange watched with a surgeon's detached horror as Sanemi's face elongated and dissolved into the storm, his scream becoming the howling of a gale that would never cease. This was the cost of the right of Icon, the price of bridging two incompatible power systems without a regulator. Strange tried to cast a sphere of safety, but his hands were numbed and nerves fried by the wild magic saturating the atmosphere. He was no longer the conductor of the symphony. He was a piece of debris caught in the hurricane. Below them, the darkness ended not in a floor, but in a vast biological ocean, a sea of flesh and bone that rippled and churned. This was the core of the fortress, the true form of the Infinity Castle stripped of its architectural pretenses. Standing on an island of white bone in the center of this meat ocean was the Demon King. But Muzan was no longer the elegant aristocrat in a suit. He had shed the pretense of humanity. He was a towering construct of white carapace and red mouths, a biological deity who had integrated the logic of the Darkhold page Kokushibo had found. His back was adorned with tubes of flesh that pumped a glowing violet fluid, the distilled essence of the magic he had harvested. He watched the falling elemental core with the many eyes of a scientist observing a volatile chemical reaction. He did not look afraid. He looked hungry. The elementals crashed into the sea of flesh, not with a splash, but with a cataclysmic release of energy. Gyome Himejima, the stone Hashira, hit the surface with the mass of a meteor. He had become a gravity-well density, singularity. Upon impact, the sea of flesh buckled and compressed, drawn irresistibly toward him. The bone island cracked. Muzan floated upward, detached from the ground by his own telekinetic will, watching as the stone elemental crushed 1,000 tons of demon biomass into a sphere of super-dense matter the size of a marble. It was a display of raw physics that would have impressed the Hulk, but here it was a tragedy, because Guillaume was trapped inside that gravity. He was the event horizon. Strange landed hard on a floating raft of rib cages, the impact jarring his teeth. He scrambled to his feet, coughing up blood that tasted of copper and failure. He looked around, trying to assess the tactical situation through the chaos. The mist Hashira Muchiro Tokito had evaporated completely, becoming a sentient fog that covered the battlefield. The fog was acidic, eating away at the flesh ocean, dissolving Muzan's biological domain at a molecular level. But Muzan simply adapted. The mouths on his body opened and inhaled the mist, filtering the acid and exhaling clean air. He was metabolizing the attack. He was immune to the elements because he had become the ecosystem. Strange realized that brute force, even elemental brute force, was useless. They were trying to burn down a forest that fed on fire. He saw Tanjiro Kamado. The boy was the last one holding on to his human form, but barely. His skin was cracking, revealing veins of molten gold beneath. The sun breathing, combined with the magic, was turning him into a living star. He knelt on the bone island, clutching his chest, his eyes burning away to reveal sockets of pure light. He was screaming, trying to hold back the transformation, trying to remember his sister's name, but the solar flare inside him was burning his memories to ash. Strange sprinted across the shifting terrain, jumping from bone to bone, dodging the tentacles of flesh that erupted from the Crimson Sea. He had to reach Tanjiro. The boy was the key. If Tanjiro went full supernova in this enclosed dimension, he wouldn't just kill Muzan. He would vaporize the planet. The containment failure would be absolute. Strange reached the island and slid to his knees beside the boy. The heat was unbearable. It singed Strange's eyebrows and blistered his skin. He didn't use a spell. He used his hands, grabbing Tanjiro's shoulders, ignoring the smell of his own burning flesh. He shouted into the boy's face, calling him by his name, commanding him to focus. Tanjiro looked at him, but there was no recognition in the blinding light of his eyes. The boy whispered that he was cold, a paradox of hypothermia amidst a nuclear reaction. The soul was freezing as the body burned. Muzan descended, landing softly on the bone island. He ignored the storm of Sanemi and the gravity of Guillaume. He focused on Strange and Tanjiro. He spoke, his voice vibrating through the marrow of the floor. He thanked the doctor for bringing him the sun. He admitted he had spent 1,000 years looking for the blue spider lily to conquer the sun, but now the sun had come to him packaged in flesh. He extended a hand and the flesh tubes on his back lashed out, not to strike but to connect. They were umbilical cords seeking a host. Muzan intended to plug himself into Tanjiro, to drain the solar essence and become the Daywalker. Strange stood up, placing himself between the Demon King and the boy. He had no artifacts. The eye of Agamotto was empty, its casing lost. The cloak was dead. He had only his mind and the ruins of his magic. He raised his trembling hands, forming the Tau mandalas. They were weak, flickering and small. Muzan laughed, a sound of tectonic grinding. He asked the sorcerer what he could possibly do with sparks against a god. Strange didn't answer. He didn't attack Muzan. He attacked the geometry of the fight. He cast a localized mirror dimension shard, not to trap Muzan, but to refract the light coming from Tanjiro. He bent the solar rays, focusing them into a laser point aimed directly at the flesh ocean. The beam cut through the floor, burning a hole into the infinite void beneath the castle. It was a distraction, a sleight of hand. Muzan flinched, shielding his eyes from the sudden brilliance. In that microsecond, Strange turned to Tanjiro. He knew he couldn't stop the transformation. The entropy was irreversible. The only way to save the world was to guide the explosion. He had to perform the ultimate surgery. He had to lobotomize the human part of Tanjiro to release the divine weapon without the hesitation of morality. It was a monstrous choice, to kill the boy to save the weapon. Strange placed his thumbs on Tanjiro's temples. He apologized, a whisper lost in the roar of the wind. Then he pushed. He pushed his own astral form into Tanjiro's mind, not to possess him, but to break the locks. He shattered the mental barriers holding the sun-breathing back. Tanjiro screamed a sound that transcended sound. The gold veins on his skin exploded. His human form disintegrated. He became a silhouette of pure white fire. The heat wave blasted Strange backward, throwing him off the island and into the flesh sea. But Strange had succeeded. Tanjiro was no longer a dying boy. He was the sun avatar. The avatar rose floating above the battlefield. It didn't look at Strange. It looked at Muzan. For the first time in a millennium, Muzan Kibutsuji felt the cellular terror of a prey animal. The light radiating from the avatar was not just hot, it was metaphysically absolute. It was the light of truth that denied the existence of shadows. Muzan roared, summoning the entire mass of the Infinity Castle to shield him. Walls of flesh and tatami slammed together, forming a cocoon of miles-thick matter around the Demon King. But the avatar simply raised a hand. The 13th form. Not a sword technique anymore. A solar flare. A wave of white fire washed over the castle. The flesh didn't burn. It evaporated. The darkness was scrubbed from existence. The elemental Hashira were caught in the wake. Sanemi the wind caught the fire and became a solar storm, scoured the upper atmosphere of the dimension. Gyome the stone absorbed the heat and became a molten core. They were synergizing. The elementals were rallying around their sun. Strange, floating in the boiling remains of the sea, watched the apotheosis. This was the end of the age of demons, but it was also the end of the age of men. The power on display was incompatible with biological life. The avatar descended upon Muzan's cocoon. It didn't strike. It merged. It flew directly into the center of the flesh mass. There was a silence, a pause in the heartbeat of the universe. Then the implosion. The Infinity Castle folded in on itself. The dimensions collapsed. Strange felt the pull. He was being dragged into the center of the sun. He closed his eyes, accepting his fate. He had caused this. He would burn with it. But then he felt a hand. A cold human hand. He opened his eyes. It was Giyu Tomioka. The water Hashira. He hadn't turned. He was the only one who hadn't participated in the rite of Icon because he had been separated during the fall. He was standing on a piece of debris, his face stoic, but his eyes filled with a terrible sadness. He looked at Strange and shook his head. He pointed to a tear in the reality above them, a fracture caused by the implosion. It was a way out. Strange argued that he couldn't leave. He had to see it through. Giyu didn't speak. He simply grabbed Strange by the collar and threw him. The physical strength of the Hashira was immense. Strange flew through the air towards the fracture. He tried to stop himself to turn back, but the vacuum of the exit sucked him in. The last thing he saw was Giyu drawing his broken sword, standing alone against the collapse facing the sun, and the monster dying within it. Giyu Tomioka, the man who believed he wasn't worthy of being a Hashira, stood his ground as the ocean of chaos swallowed him whole, providing the final anchor of calm water that allowed the reaction to stabilize. Stephen Strange, hit the ground of the real world hard. He was back in the ruins of the Ubuyashiki estate. It was night. The moon was full. The air was silent. There was no castle, no demons, no slayers, just a massive crater in the ground where the dimensional anchor had been. The silence was deafening. Strange lay in the dirt staring at the stars. He waited for the explosion. He waited for the shockwave that would destroy Japan. But it never came. Instead, a gentle breeze blew across the crater. A breeze that felt strangely like a rough hand patting a head. Strange sat up. He looked at the crater. In the center there was no fire. There was a garden. An impossible garden of stone and flowers that had grown in seconds. Massive rock formations stood like sentinels. Gayome. The trees bent and swayed with a perpetual wind that never stopped. Sanemi. A mist hung low over the ground. Muchiro. And in the center grew a single giant wisteria tree, glowing with a faint golden light. The sun. Tanjiro. They hadn't destroyed the world. They had become it. They had sealed Muzan by becoming the landscape that buried him. The no-clean victory was absolute. The demon slayer core was extinct. The demons were gone not because they were hunted, but because their progenitor had been entombed in a prison of living elements. Strange stood up. His legs shook. He reached for his magic. It was there, but it was faint. The ley lines of this world had been rewritten. The ambient mana was gone used up by the transformation. Strange was no longer the Sorcerer Supreme of this dimension. He was just a doctor in a world that didn't believe in magic anymore. He walked to the edge of the crater. He saw something glinting in the grass. He picked it up. It was the hilt of a sword. The blade was gone. It was Rengoku's guard. The flames were cold. Strange put it in his pocket. He turned to leave but stopped. He felt eyes on him. Not a threat. A witness. He looked toward the tree line. Kanao Tsuyuri stood there. She had lost one eye in the earlier battles. She looked at the crater, then at Strange. She didn't ask where they were. She knew. She could feel them. She walked past Strange into the garden. She knelt by the glowing wisteria tree and placed her hand on the bark. The tree pulsed once, a warm heartbeat of light. Kanao began to cry silent tears that watered the roots. Strange realized his role was over. He was the catalyst, not the hero. He had come to fix a breach, and instead, he had performed a trans-species euthanasia. He had cured the demon plague by sacrificing the antibodies. He adjusted his tattered tunic. The cold of the Japanese mountain night bit into his skin. He needed to find a way home. But he knew that the man who returned to the Sanctum sanctorum would not be the same man who left. He had looked into the abyss of biology and blinked. He began the long walk down the mountain. As he walked, he passed the graves of the other slayers who had died before the final battle. He stopped at one, the grave of the wind, Hashira's brother, Genya. Strange placed a hand on the stone. He whispered a spell of remembrance, a minor illusion that would keep the name on the stone from ever eroding. It was a petty magic, a parlor trick compared to what he used to do, but it was all he had left. He realized that this world was now a closed system. The demons were gone, but so was the wonder. It was a mundane world now, safe, sterile, and lonely. The sun began to rise. It crested the mountains, illuminating the new landscape. The light hit the wisteria tree in the crater, and the tree seemed to sing a high, resonant frequency that only Strange could hear. It was a song of gratitude and goodbye. Strange closed his eyes and let the sun hit his face. It was warm, but it wasn't Tanjiro. Tanjiro was the tree. The sun was just a star. Strange opened his eyes and walked away, leaving the Garden of Heroes behind. He reached the port of Yokohama 3 weeks later. He had walked the length of the country, observing the changes. The wisteria flowers were blooming everywhere now, aggressive and invasive, spreading across the land like a purple wildfire. The ecosystem was rebalancing. The fear of the night was fading from the populace. They didn't know why the demons had stopped coming. They just knew the nightmare was over. Strange found a ship bound for America. He didn't have money, but he traded his medical skills for passage. He worked in the ship's infirmary, treating sailors for scurvy and broken bones. No magic, just stitches and splints. It was humbling. It was grounding. On the second night at sea, he stood on the deck looking at the reflection of the moon on the water. He thought of Giyu, the water Hashira, who had stayed behind to close the door. Strange wondered if Giyu was dead, or if he was swimming in that eternal ocean of the void. He hoped for the latter. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the eye of Agamotto. The lid was fused shut. The mechanism was melted. The time stone was dormant, or perhaps it had abandoned him. He held the dead relic over the railing. He considered dropping it into the ocean, letting it sink to the bottom of this alien sea. But he couldn't. It was his burden. He put it back in his pocket. He turned back to the infirmary. A sailor had a fever. Dr. Strange had work to do. The timeline would be recorded in the Book of the Vishanti as a cautionary footnote. The Demon Slayer anomaly. It would be studied by future Sorcerer Supremes as an example of the dangers of cross-pollination. They would analyze the tactical errors, the moral compromises, the sheer messiness of it all. But they wouldn't understand the silence of the crater. They wouldn't understand the weight of the wisteria. Strange knew that he would never speak of it. He would never tell Wong. He would never tell Claire. He would lock this memory in the deepest vault of his mind. Because in the end, he hadn't saved the day. He had just changed the nature of the night. The ship cut through the dark water, moving away from the land of the rising sun. Stephen Strange went below deck to wash his hands. He scrubbed them for a long time, trying to get the invisible blood out from under his fingernails. But the stain remained. It always would. The rhythmic sound of waves against a hull, a heartbeat of a world that kept turning indifferent to the cost of its survival. The screen faded to black, leaving only the sound of the ocean and the faint lingering smell of burnt sugar and ozone. The crossover was complete. The door was closed, and the doctor was alone. The entry in the Book of the Vishanti is catalogued under subsection Omega Kyojuro, a classification reserved for timelines that have been permanently quarantined due to metaphysical contamination. Stephen Strange sat at his mahogany desk in the Sanctum sanctorum of Earth 616. The smell of Earl Grey tea doing little to displace the phantom scent of wisteria and ozone that still clung to his olfactory memory. He had returned 3 days ago, sliding through a natural weak point in the reality barrier created by the sheer density of the sun avatar's manifestation, but he had returned empty-handed. The eye of Agamotto on his chest was a replacement taken from a parallel past, and his hands trembled not from nerve damage, but from the withdrawal of the hyper-oxygenated blood flow he had maintained for months. Wong stood by the bookshelf, holding a feather duster, his expression filled with the silent question he had been afraid to ask since the Sorcerer Supreme stumbled out of a dimensional rift, wearing rags and carrying a broken katana guard. Strange dipped his quill into the pot of ink, ensuring the liquid was mixed with the dust of a crushed mandrake root to bind the words to the page. He was not writing a memoir, he was writing a warning. The text described the dangers of introducing high magic concepts into low magic biological systems. It detailed how the breath of a human could be weaponized to the point where the human ceases to exist. Strange paused looking at the flame guard of Kyojuro Rengoku, which sat on his desk as a paperweight. The flames on the steel were cold, but if he concentrated, he could feel the heat of a resolve that burned brighter than any Faltinian fire. The world he had left behind was now designated Earth TRN 880 to a reality where the weather patterns were sentient. Satellite telemetry from the multiverse monitoring station showed that Japan was now covered in a perpetual cloud layer that moved with strategic intent, and the seismic activity in the region pulsed with a rhythm identical to a human heartbeat. The demons were extinct, but humanity lived in a benevolent totalitarianism of nature, where the sun shone only on the righteous and the wind flayed the wicked. It was a paradise forged in horror. Strange finished the entry, blowing gently on the ink to dry it. He wrote the final conclusion, stating that the integration of the mystic arts and total concentration breathing resulted in a 100% mortality rate for the practitioners and a permanent alteration of the planetary ecosystem. He closed the heavy leather cover of the book, sealing the history away. He stood up and walked to the window of the worlds, looking out at the chaotic mundane street traffic of New York. A taxi honked, a sound of impatient commerce. Strange smiled a thin, humorless expression. He preferred the honking. It was noise. It was messy. It was human. The silence of the elemental garden he had left behind was too heavy for a man to bear. He turned to Wong and asked if the tea was ready. Wong nodded, pouring a cup. Strange took it, his hand steadying as he inhaled the steam. He was the Sorcerer Supreme again. The nightmare was over. But in the back of his mind, whenever he took a breath, he counted the seconds, instinctively waiting for the oxygen to ignite a fire that was no longer there. The timeline was closed, but the breath remained.